So Jacob heard the Nazis were coming, but they were only coming after the men. So he and his brother left their families in Poland and headed to Russia. There, they were captured and sent to a labor camp in Siberia. Jacob's brother died in the camp. Jacob was able to leave weighing 81 pounds. And when he returned home, the Germans had killed his wife and 3 young sons. At the beginning of the invasion, Zipporah took her young daughter Esther and moved to southern Poland. There she took on the identity of a Christian friend. She worked as a housekeeper in a Christian home and enrolled Esther in a Catholic school. After the war, she returned home to learn her husband had died in a concentration camp. Friends told Jacob and Zipporah they should marry. They did, more out of necessity than love. They both moved forward with deep pain and scars of the past, and they had one son together. Today, my conversation is with that son as he tells the story of his mom and dad's life during and after the Holocaust. Here's a fascinating conversation with my Jewish friend, Arie Harel. Well, Arie, thanks so much for joining us on this podcast. We really, really appreciate it.
I feel privileged, to be honest with you, to participate in this session, truly.
You're a good friend, and there are so many people here who will be listening to this podcast who know you and ask about you on a regular basis. We're going to talk about your family, your mom and your dad, and some things they went through that I think is a fascinating story that focuses on God's sovereignty and his protection. Before we jump into that, how are you doing? How are you and your family? I know that the last time we talked, it was right after October 7th and everything that happened there. And how are you and your family and the morale of Israel?
Well, my family, thank God, health-wise, we're all okay. We're good. The atmosphere around us, needless to say, is not so great. More so on a day like this, today, actually tomorrow, I'm sorry. We're going to receive dead bodies from October 7th. And so here we are in a very confused situation. On one hand, you can see families who didn't know, actually, until today or yesterday, who among their relatives who were in that event is alive or not, because Hamas kept it secret all the way until a few hours ago. So on one hand, you can see those families who just found out that their relatives are alive. What health shape are they is a different story, but they're alive. And some of them are even walking on their legs. And yet, on the other hand, and this is going to be also just in a few hours, other families are going to receive dead bodies that, again, they didn't know, they were not certain who is alive and who is not alive. Hamas kept us in a very, very bad situation. So to answer your question, it's a very, very confused situation where you can find joy and sadness, mournings and laughters all around us. This is what I can, share with you at this point.
Yeah. I saw today that I think one of the families you're talking about was a mother and 2 daughters that are dead.
That's a tragedy. That's a tragedy by itself. Yes, yes. One member of the family managed to survive. The others were we didn't know because Hamas would not share it with us. We were hoping, we were praying, but the feeling at the beginning was that they are no longer alive. Until today or yesterday, we got the final proof, just like you saw in the media, that they are dead. But they, in a way, became like the symbol of this catastrophe. How dare Hamas, with all of their fight for freedom and on, how have they dared taking infants, children, babies, and butchered them. And I'm not mentioning men and women and all that. How can they even talk about the fight for freedom while being faced with atrocities like we have? This is unacceptable. Unacceptable, and whatever you can say.
Well, we're praying for you and Israel and everything going there, and to know all the emotions that go with this time where hostages are coming back, and as you say, some families there's great joy. They finally get their loved one back, and then some families that reality of losing a loved one sets in. So it has to be a really confusing time, as you say.
I do have to I do have to say though that with all the difficulties that Israel is facing, Israel is strong. The morale is strong. And despite the differences in opinions, political and others, that we have here in Israel, the unity of our nation is by far stronger from what you might have heard of the discussions and the disagreements and so on and so forth. Israel is strong, and this is something I need you to understand. Israel is strong, the morale is strong, and we know that together, we can manage these difficult times and come out of it even stronger in our feelings, in our emotions, and in our beliefs. Let's not forget it.
Well, Ari, what I want to do is to go back in time to another extremely difficult, confusing, and challenging time in Israel's history. And I know your mom and your dad, your family that you grew up with, they had history with they had families before they came together to have you. Um, I want you to tell that story. You have brother and sisters?
I have a sister. She is actually half sister. She's my half sister because my mother brought her into this marriage with my father after losing all the other members of the family. But yes, I do have a sister that for me, from the moment I opened my eyes when I was born, she was already there. And the 11 years that are separating us, for me, it's she was there all along. So yes, technically, if you want, she's my half sister. But I never ever felt this way because she was around. She was my big sister. She taught me everything. She punished me when necessary, and so on. So yes, she's my 1,000% my sister.
That's
Though
great.
technically she was born to my mother, but she had another father. Yes.
That's great. Um, let's go back to your mom and your dad. They
Yeah.
had families before you, and so
Correct.
let's start with your dad. He was married, he had a family, and then um, Nazi Germany and the war and everything broke out, and the persecution against you. So let's start with the story of your dad, and then we'll go to the story of your mom.
Okay. My father was one of five brothers and sisters who lived in Poland. He had family. He had three sons that he lost during the Holocaust, and of course, a wife. Um, he was he was born to a religious family. They were Orthodox, all of them. And let me jump for just a second to the very end. I hope that editing wise it'll make sense. But my father came out of the war, out of the Holocaust, with a stronger belief, with a stronger faith. Whereas my mother, and we'll get to it a little bit later, she came as non-believer. To be honest with you, she came back to her faith, but that would take decades. Only during her last years, if you want. My father said, "Yes, God who is the one who saved me. It is because of God that I was saved. Whereas my mom, she would say, there can't be any God if such atrocities can happen. In this contradiction, in this extremes, this was the family that I was born into. There were no arguments. I need to insist that there were no arguments, faith arguments or theological arguments in the family. No. But the discussions were there. They never fought, at least not in front of my eyes, about that fact, but it was all around, it was all in the air. My father took me to the synagogue and we would go there a few times during the week, and my mother did not go. And so on and so forth. So it was a house of contrasts that I grew up in. That's true.
That's interesting, isn't it? And I think that's typical of so many Jews who went through the Holocaust. Some, their faith was strengthened, and some turned away. I think that's a fascinating study of what happened in Judaism after the Holocaust. So your dad is in Poland.
They were in Poland, and when the war, on September 1st, when the war broke out, when the Nazis invaded Poland, there was the rumor that the Nazis, I'm talking about 1939, September, October, November of 1939, the rumor was that the Nazis were after the men because they wanted the men to be killed, okay, to massacre them. And so my father and his brother, by the way, left home and they ran eastwards. The rumor was that in Soviet Russia, they would be saved. So, and this is what was happening. My father and his brother, they left their families and went eastwards, where the Soviets caught them in forced labor camps and sent them to Siberia. My uncle, whom I never saw, whom I never met, by the way, lost his life in that forced labor camp because the situation there was terrible. I mean, this is the understatement of what I can say. And this is what my father told me. So he died in the camps. And my father, let me figure it out. My father weighed 81 pounds, more or less, when he came out from the war, because the Soviets, they saved on everything, on clothing and food and so on. And yet they had to go every morning to work in Siberia, more so in this cold, below zero temperature that the cold Siberia is having. So after the war, when the war ended, my father came back to Poland, obviously to reach for his family. And only then he realized that his 3 sons and his wife were massacred, butchered by the Nazis. And then a mutual friend who knew my father and who will become my mother got them together, and he told them, look, you guys, you both lost everything, almost everything. My mother saved her mother and her daughter, but my father lost everyone. Why don't you give it a try? That's what was kind of offered for them. So it was not a marriage of love. You need to understand that. It was a marriage of survival, hanging on to life, hanging with the nails, to life, to move on. And what can I say?
Yeah, so that had to be devastating. I mean, I can't even imagine what your dad went through. He thought he was going away to save his family, and he came back to realize that his family, his sons. How old were his sons at that time?
I can still. I have a photo of him and his wife and the three sons. When the war broke out in 1939, they were 3, 7, and 11.
Mm.
The three sons. I cannot ignore the feelings. Going back for just a second for what we are facing, what we are experiencing now in Israel, when similar stories also happened, when families were butchered, when a member of the family or two members of the family managed to make it through the catastrophe on October 7th. But I can, more than once, seriously, more than once lately, I can literally see my father coming back from Siberia and realizing that he is all by himself. The truth is that he had three sisters that left to Palestine at that time, that will become Israel, before the war. They belonged to a pioneering movement, to a Zionist movement, and so they left with the Zionist movement to Palestine before the war. And my father left. My father was in Poland. He, for all kind of reasons that I'm not even familiar with, chose not to go to Palestine. But his three sisters were already here in two kibbutzim and in Haifa. So he came to Haifa. At that point, he was already married, and because my parents got married in Poland before the war. After this friend of them got them together, and they said, "Okay, let's give it a try." And I can
So
only
that,
admire. I mean,
yeah.
so
So
I
that's your
can. Yeah, go ahead.
well. That's your dad's story.
Yeah,
Talk about your mom's story. Was she in Poland as well?
she was in Poland, yes, and when the war broke out and when Nazis invaded Poland, she had an idea. I mean, her husband, my mother's husband, was taken to a forced labor camp because it was true that the Nazis at the beginning, at the very beginning, were after the men. So her husband was taken, and she was left with her mother and her daughter. Now, the story continues when my mother had a very good Christian friend. They grew up together as kids. They were neighbors, they were kids, two girls, and they became very, very good friends. So my mother knew her girlfriend's story from A to Z. She visited her home. She went even to church, and her friend went to the synagogue. They were like sisters. So at that point, when my mother realized that her girlfriend left Poland, she went to a nursing school. She wanted to become a nurse, and so she took her personality on her with forged papers. She took the name and the personality, and she pretended to be Christian. So there's a whole story that I don't want to spend too much time on the details of it, but knowing that, or being afraid, sorry, that someone may recognize that my father is not really Christian, but she's Jewish, knowing from the neighborhood, she decided to move to the southern part of Poland. And there's a story that there was a horse and there was a wagon, and my mother took her mother, and who will become my sister, and the three of them went on this wagon heading southwards.
Arie, your mom has a Christian friend. This Christian friend is a nurse. She goes off to train, and so your mom took on the persona
Yes, exactly.
of the
Exactly.
Christian friend, and then she ended up going out more toward South Poland in the country.
Yes,
Talk
yes,
about her
exactly.
life there.
Well, I think again, I think it's quite interesting as they went down south, all Christian. Okay, uh, my mother knew that the Gestapo knew about Jewish people impersonating to be Christians, not knowing. So she told her mother, my Safta as we call it. She told her mother to play numb. So when the Gestapos come, She told her mother, my mother told her mother to keep quiet, to not to talk, as if she couldn't speak, she couldn't talk. That took care on the language barrier. Whereas with my sister, my mother every day in the afternoon, because the Nazis were very precise timing wise, and they knew when the time was when the Gestapo would come to search for Jewish people who were impersonating. So she took her out. She took my, who will become my sister, she took her out to play in the playground. You know, like kids, they like to play summers and winters. And they had these arguments because my sister would she would want to go out to the cold, outside. But my mother insisted, obviously not telling my sister what was the reason, but she made a point not to be around the home, even though she was playing Christian and so on and so forth. But then again, they went out uh, for the time that they knew that the Gestapo would come. So this is how she spent the time when my sister during the day, again, not wanting to be around, just moving to all kind of places, my mother took my sister and put her in church. Uh, how do you call a church where they, not a church, where they teach Christian kids, like a kindergarten
Yeah,
for
preschool or catechism or yeah.
a Catholic school, kind of, in a church. And again, this is how she would spend the time during the day. They got up in the morning. My mother took my sister to this Christian Catholic church to spend the day. Let me just go fast forward to the very end. My sister, who is with us, she's now 86 of age. My sister would take Israeli kids to go to Poland for the Holocaust, after the Holocaust visits, okay, to show the kids, the Israeli high school students, what was Poland like, the death camps, and so on and so forth. And this is where my sister would tell the students, the Israeli students, her story. And there was something that she kept telling us and the Israeli students as well. When they went for the first few times that they were in Poland with that Israeli school, and when they went to visit the church that my sister spent the time, as they entered into this Catholic church, she bowed down, my sister, intuitively, without feeling it, without thinking about it. It was an instinct that she bowed down to the cross, and then she caught herself. Well, wait, what am I doing? And so on. So this is again is kind of a leftover from that story. When the war ended and my mother met my father, I want, Ron, I want to get now, unless you have other questions, I want to get to the time when my family invited the lady who that my mother. I didn't mention it, but my mother was working in a Christian home. She was a maid. She was clean. She would cook and so on. And at her older ages, my mother, my family, invited that lady, that Christian lady from Poland, to come and visit the holy sites, Jerusalem, Nazareth, Bethlehem, and so on. Uh, so this is part one of the story. That woman, that lady, old lady by then, when they came to visit, at the very end, almost the very end, I witnessed what I'm going to share with you now. We were at Ben Gurion Airport. Needless to say that my mother and that lady, they never exchanged a word about while she was in Poland. I'm talking now while my mother was in Poland at this lady's home. Obviously, they never shared a word about my mother's background. Okay? And the same was during the Christian lady visit to Israel. All through the visit, now that she knew that my mother was Jewish, of course, and so on, they never shared a word about the time that they spent during the war. At the very end, I was there at Ben Gurion Airport. My mother asked that lady, "Did you know?" For the first time, for the very first time after the war, this is when it came out. And the answer, I'm still shivering because of the answer. The old Christian lady said, "Who do you think went down to the basement?" Because my mother and her daughter stayed in the basement. "Who do you think went down on Friday night after you went to sleep and removed all traces from the candles that you lit up? Jewish women light candles on Friday afternoon, Friday evening. This is the welcoming of the Sabbath. It's a typical Jewish sign. Orthodox, non-Orthodox, many women are doing it." So she asked my mother, that old lady, "Who do you think went down and removed all traces of the candles that you left lit?" Because you're not allowed to cut the flame of the candles. In other words, she knew all along. She knew all along, and yet they never exchanged a word. To finish that part, when my mother was already aging and she was more and more limited in her maneuverings and so on, we have invited the lady's daughter, who by then was already, I think, 50 or 60 or something, to come and help my mother. Like what you guys do with the Filipinos, I think, that they come and help elderly people. The daughter of that Christian lady who hosted my mother all during the war, she took care of my mother as she was aging in Israel. And then my mother passed away and she went back home. So
That's amazing. What an amazing
yeah,
story.
yeah,
What an
yeah.
amazing story. So your mother lost her husband.
Yes.
Your father lost his wife and three sons.
Correct.
And so when they came back, there were those who said, and you said this earlier, I want to say it again, there were those who said, you both lost your family, so it'd be good for you to get together. And you said it wasn't a relationship of love, but it was one of survival. We're two people who have lost our families, and so let's make a go of it, right?
Absolutely. Very true. And I felt it, I saw it at home. When I grew up, again, my father knew that he had to go out to work in the morning and he had to bring the money and he had to bring the food, the routine. But there was no affection. I'm watching couples. You watch couples in America and so on. Those who are okay, at least, okay. There's this body language. There's this gestures. When two people live together and when they truly love each other, you can tell. You can say that. You can see that. Never that with my family. It was practicality. I think this is what I can say. Practical life. We need this. We need that. For them tomorrow, we need A, B, and C, and so on. It was only during, I think, the last 3 or 4 years of their life. At that time, they lived in Haifa. My family, myself, lived in the south. It was during her last years, I think, their last years, I think, that uh, I saw them, the two of them, getting closer and closer. Like when we would come to Haifa for a visit or the weekend and so on, very often we would find them, you know, sitting together, playing cards, talking softly. You could say by the body language that has changed big time from the time that I grew up in that home until I was with them during the last few years, and I saw it happening. I saw I saw the I can even say the love, the caring, who would I would translate into a late love. They cared for each other. They really cared for each other.
None of us can, unless you've gone through it, none of us could even imagine the Holocaust and your dad being in a Siberian forced labor camp, losing his brother down to 81 pounds. I mean, he's in a very unhealthy situation.
A walking skeleton.
Walking skeleton. Your mom, I can't imagine living under the tension of every day knowing that Gestapo is going to come by, and maybe you left something out, or like this Christian lady mentioned, she got all the evidence on Friday nights of the candles that burned. The trauma that you would live through, how that would impact you for years and years and years, the rest of your life. I mean, you're not going to get over that. That's something that's going to go with you. And all right, talk a little bit more about it. Your dad went through that, and his faith became Judaism. You guys are Jews and hold to Orthodox Judaism. Your dad did. His faith became stronger. Your mom went through that and said, no, how could God do this? Talk about those two contrasting responses, which was pretty common, I think, in Israel after the war.
The two of them have developed two lifestyles, I would say. When my mother, for instance, I think she would go to the synagogue once, maybe twice a year. Okay, she kept kosher at home out of respect to my father. But then she would take me to the beach on Saturday. Haifa is very close to the beach, and so Saturdays, when you're not supposed to drive your vehicle and so on, she would take our car and take me, and of course we'll go to the beach. My father, you mentioned that his faith got stronger. That's true, very true. But he was not one of those fanatics. He was not one of those extreme Orthodox. No, no, no. He was more of a liberal Jew, I would say. In America, you love you love. He was not totally orthodox, and yet he was not conservative. He was somewhere between conservative and reform, because what he would say to me on Saturdays, he said to me, Arie, come to the synagogue. I want you to stay until the second prayer is done, then go home. And he knew exactly what am I going to do when he said go home, because my mother was waiting for me, and she would take the car and she would drive to the beach. So this coexistence, I can say, was part of my life. Yes, one would think that it was a house full of tension. Yes, there was tension, but it did not. Well, I think I'm normal. I think I grew up normal, living in between these two situations. But I think that I benefited from both worlds. I am Jewish, I am a believer, and so on and so forth. And yet, I can also enjoy life, which is not exactly 100% typical to ultra-Orthodox Judaism that we have in Israel, or elsewhere, not only in Israel. So this was the kind of home that I grew up in. We would go to the synagogue, we would light the candles on Shabbat, on Friday night, and I would go and I would pray. And my mother ran her life. She had her friends, and this was okay. This was okay. This is the kind of homes that I grew up in.
Yeah. So you grow up. You're a young man now, and Holocaust survivors' sons are exempt from mandatory military service, right?
Yes, I mean, nowadays that we are far away, there's more than 75 years 80 years more than from the Holocaust. But the answer is yes. We were exempt from combat units, uh, and yet, and this again is the kind of house that I grew up in, a Zionist house, a Zionist home, a Zionist family, my family. And when the time came, and I knew that I would be exempt from the combat units. I insisted to participate. But for this, in order to participate in the combat unit, I was in the Armored Corps, became an officer, and so on. But I had to get my father's signature. They had to authorize myself going into a combat unit. It took me many years after of course, I went to my father, he signed me. I did not realize the sacrifice that he had performed while signing for me this signature that later on got me to the Egyptian front in the Six-Day War, and then, of course, in the October War in 1973. I did not realize only until later on, long after I participated, only then I understood the sacrifice that he had done after losing the three sons to allow me to go back to the battlefield. Thank God, God led me the way that I managed to come out from the October War alive, not even wounded, alive. But I only realized what a great suffering, what a great sacrifice my father did when he signed for me.
It's amazing when we get older. At the time, you're raring to go and you want that signature. Later on, you understand, wow, my
the
dad.
Significance of it, yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
I want to wrap up with a story, Arie.
One thing I excuse me for interrupting. I had to fight with my father. I had to fight with him very strongly. Okay. In America, I think you can get your driving license at the age of 16 or 17, something like this. In Israel, it was only at 18. But I could ride a motorcycle at the age of 16. Like every other, teenager, I wanted very badly to start driving. So I went to my parents and I asked them to buy me a motorcycle. I said I also worked being an accordionist and so on, so I made some money, and there was this deal. I will pay half the motorcycle. My dad will pay the other half, and my father refused. He would not allow me to ride a motorcycle. He said it's too dangerous. I had my sufferings already, and I don't want to expose myself again to something like this. When the time comes, at the age of 18, I'll buy you a car. Now, you can only understand at the age of 16 what 2 years mean when you're 16 and you had to wait 2 full years. Come on. So, what can I tell you? I had to suffer, to wait. But he would not allow me to. So, he understood where to draw the line. To be honest with you, I did not. I did not. Uh, one more memory from my home. My father never ever hit me. You're 3-year old, you're 4, 5, 6. There comes a time there's tension, and then sometimes you get a smack. There was only one time in my entire life. I don't remember what was it all about, but he slapped my face. And then he went to cry. And it was my mother who told me what he had to go through after he suffered more than me because he had to smack his son. Because my three brothers, his three sons, were always around. Always around. So this is another memory that I bring from home.
It sounds like you had a special relationship with your dad?
You know, he already died, 12 years ago and so on. And there's a memorial day, of course, and there's a ceremony. But I'm telling, we're having this memorial service, but I keep telling my family, I don't need it because I have my father with me. I wouldn't say 24/7, but at least once or twice a day that I can grab something from this memory or that memory. He's with me. His impact on my life is and still was and still is super strong. Super, super strong.
So you join the service. You are promoted fairly rapidly, and you are now the head of you're a captain, I think, or I don't know your
Lieutenant
title.
Colonel. Lieutenant Colonel.
Lieutenant Colonel. Lieutenant Colonel.
Lieutenant Colonel, yes.
And
Being in
you're in
charge
charge. You're in charge of tanks during the
correct.
6 Day War.
No. I was part of in the 6 Day War, but I was not an officer then. I had to load, to unload ammunition at Haifa port from boats who would bring, from vessels who would bring ammunition to the military. I was part of these guys who unloaded those vessels. I took part in the October War in 1973.
73.
That was the war that I participated in.
So tell the story. You're in your tank and you're up against some big odds, and you tell a story from the Old Testament to your troops.
Well, first of all, I'm in the synagogue. There's Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement. I'm praying, and all of a sudden there's a siren going on. You maybe remember that on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the country pauses. Everything stopped. Everything stops. No radio, no television, no nothing. And all of a sudden there's a siren going on. So we knew immediately that there was something very special, very unusual going on. Long story short, in the reserves, we each know when an emergency situation happens. We know where to show up. I have this backpack with me that is always ready to go, and the Bible is always with me. There was a time, Ron, that Bibles were read from a book with pages, not like from from cell phones like today. So I had the real Bible with me all the time. So we knew exactly where to report and what to do. And so we would go to this meeting point, and we were taken to the battlefield. I was fighting in Egypt, in Sinai, and the situation was bad. The situation was bad. We all say that the last October 7th, the catastrophe on October 7th was bad, and it was indeed very, very bad. It was a catastrophe. And yet, on October 6th of 1973, the situation, in my opinion, some may argue that, but in my opinion, was much worse. Because again, Israel was caught on surprise. There was no military behind us. Long story short, we would run to the battlefield, myself, my unit, tanks, and so on. And you can only imagine the situation, not having tank carriers, these huge trucks that would take the tanks, not having them, so we had to go on tracks to the battlefield. I'm talking about at least 200 miles to go, which is a long distance from Jerusalem, that is where we lived at that time, all the way to Sinai. Long story short, we're reaching the outskirts of the battlefield, and from the distance, we can see the flares of the fightings that were going on. And you could see it many times on television, so on. You have the flares from the shells coming out, but they were approaching our direction as we were moving on, as we were moving forward. You asked me about the morale of Israel. You can only imagine the morale of the soldiers, not only my soldiers, the whole army was moving forward. And I knew that at some point I was afraid that I'll be on my own. Because at one point I hear that tank A, for instance, broke a track. Tank B got paralyzed. And I knew that it was not exactly technical matters. My soldiers freaked out. They were afraid. It was at night, we got together, and we knew that in the morning, early in the morning, in the military, you have this exercise that before sunrise, everybody is in the tanks and we get ready to go. But having faced with this situation when all of a sudden tanks broke out because of all kind of technical reasons which were false just because it's true, my soldiers were afraid. I understood that I had to do something different, something special that is not exactly put in the draft that we got as officers just getting ready to go to the war. So in the tanks we have this situation where I can usually a tank myself like a commander. I'm talking to my officers. Okay, I'm talking to the officers, and the officers talk to the tank commanders, and the tank commanders talk to the crewmen. This is the chain of command. Okay, but there is a way for me, for everyone in the tank corps, to switch on so I can talk. The commander can talk to each and every crewman, and this is the order that I gave them: switch to the channel where I can talk to each and every crewman in my unit. I reached for my backpack, took the Bible, opened it up, and read to them the story of Gideon. The story of Gideon having God with him, as Gideon told his people, see what I'm doing and do likewise. And I read by breaking each and every military procedure. You don't read the Bible when you give military commands to your soldiers. This is not what military frequency is used for. It's against the law. You can be court-martialed for that. But there was a war, and I understood that there was something special, very special, different that I had to do. I reached out to my Bible, and I read to them the full story with Gideon, of Gideon, from A to Z. And when I finished reading it to them, I told them, turn on your engines and follow me. We ended up that war being stationed 101 kilometers, which is like 60 miles outside of Cairo city center. And there was no Egyptian tank at that time between us and Cairo. We have managed to defeat each and every Egyptian unit that was in between to try to stop us from reaching Cairo. Unfortunately, and I will repeat it, unfortunately, it was your Secretary of State at the time who forced us to stop, because he understood, Henry Kissinger understood for his reasons, that allowing us to have a too good of a triumph is also not good for the future plans that he had in mind. So that's where we stopped. And the whole unit, every time, every year, we have our Memorial Day on the Day of Independence. We have our Memorial Day. Nowadays, we are already old, and some of us are no longer with us. We have lost a few during the years and also during the war. But every year on the Memorial Day, we meet in the cemetery, the military cemetery. They always ask me to read it again. But last time I made it a little bit different. I had my grandson who came with me to read it to whoever participated in that service. And this is a tradition that we're repeating every year now. Story of Gideon.
Story of Gideon. That's a great story that reminds us that it's all about God, isn't it? It's all about God. He's the one who
absolutely
gives us the victory in the battle, for sure, for sure. Arie, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you taking time to do this, and I appreciate your friendship. I love how God has worked in your life and is working in your life, and I thank you so much for telling the story of your mom and her family before you and your dad and his family before you. And I think it's a powerful story of God's protection and just the way he works in life and our response to struggles and challenges in life. So
thank you. And thank you for allowing me to share it with you. I really, really, really feel privileged to be able to, first of all, to see you and to talk to you and to share my story. And I'm not special. I can tell you that my story, just as you understand, similar story like myself, like my story, is widely shared in our country. You can find endless numbers of similar examples of Holocaust survivors, of officers in the Israeli IDF, Defense Force, and so on. So I'm just one of many. I'm not special. I have to tell you that. I don't feel special, and I'm not special. But
well,
this is Israel.
I appreciate that. You're special to us, and so we appreciate you sharing that. I got one more question for you. So I have been doing these devotionals. We did it through the book of Genesis, and I'm getting ready to start the book of Job. God's story in you, God's story in your suffering, and Job's a book of tremendous faith as well. So as a Jew, when I say the book of Job, what comes to your mind?
Stubbornness, faith, great, great, great faith. With all the challenges they had to go through, I think faith is the key word that I will use in wanting to, when asked to describe Job in one word, that's the one I would use. Faith.
That's a great word. I think so many times people think of Job as suffering, and he did that.
Absolutely, no question.
What a demonstration that he never lost faith in the God he loved and the God that loved him.
That's exactly the way I see it. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Arie, we can't wait to see you again. We'll be in touch before we travel over to Israel, but we look forward to seeing you in person soon. And thank you again so much for joining us today.
I'm so looking forward to it. So looking forward. I love you. What can I say? I love you.
And you too. You too. Man, that was an amazing story. I can't even imagine the fear and the pain and the grief experienced by those who lived through the Holocaust. Arie's mom, interestingly, turned from God, and Arie's dad turned toward God. The challenges of life cause us to decide about God, don't they? And today I pray, whatever you're going through, I pray that drives you closer to him, not away from him. I pray you take comfort in his love and his strength. He loved us so much that he sent Jesus to die on the cross for our sins so that we could have an eternal relationship with him. And he's always going to give you, if he did that, he promises to always give us everything we need to do what he's called us to do. Well, it takes a lot of people to put this podcast on. I want to thank our team. Our executive director is Jen Booth. Ryan Jorgen produces each podcast. Mark James delivers each podcast right to you. Laura Crane promotes each episode through social media. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast platform and hit like. That simple tap on that screen helps us deliver our message to more and more people. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time.